Hello everybody, this is RodLab tutorial number 5, and in this tutorial I want to talk a little bit about Bendform analysis, why we would want to do it, what we expect to get out of it, and also how we're doing it in RodLab. So let's come over here. I've already got a RodLab window open. As you can see, I've got our 7613 LT taper up, and I've got a few Bendforms already created. So our idea and our goal with Bendform analysis would be to get an idea of how a rod would feel and perform in the real world without ever having built that rod in the shop. So this might be a taper that I've downloaded off the internet, or it could also be one of my existing tapers that I've modified and tried to give a new set of characteristics or make some changes to. I want to test how those are going to work without actually spending the 40, 80 to 100 hours to actually build that rod. So we might do that a couple ways. One way might be, once we've got a bend form, we can come over here and look at how our bend angles are changing, where the stresses are in the rod, the torques. And from that, we might be able to get an idea of how the rod feels. Another thing we might be able to do would be to pick a rod that we've already built and are familiar with and compare the two. So I've added the 7613, the Howells version 1950. We can calculate those, put them side by side, and do some comparisons based on that. So I'm going to take that off for now. What I really want to focus on is the single bend form right here. So this is our 7613 LT, and it's bent to this acceleration factor of 5. And what I want to look at is what exactly we need to know to figure out how the rod's bent. So the first thing we would need is an expression for the stiffness of the rod along the length. And that's just going to depend on a handful of things. It's going to depend on the cross section. It's going to depend on the bamboo itself. The bamboo characteristics vary across a culm. It's going to depend on how I'm hollowing that rod, or if I'm hollowing it in the tooling I'm using. And it's going to depend on the cross section. Is it a hex? Is it a quad? And the other factor we need to look at is the loads that are on this rod. That's going to be a big factor, obviously, in how it bends. So this line up here is going to be pulling on the rod, and it's going to influence the bend form. Other factors are going to be the rod itself. As we're accelerating the rod forward during this simulated casting stroke, then we're going to have bending that's based on the actual mass of the rod itself. So the bamboo in the rod, it's going to depend on the ferrule, where it's located, the finish, the guides, all those factors are going to come into how the rod bends. And to be clear, I'm not exactly trying to create a casting stroke itself. I want to be similar to a casting stroke, but if you think about an actual casting stroke in your head, you're snapping the line back, you're snapping the line forward, there's varying accelerations, and the casting stroke that you're using for rod A would be completely different than the casting stroke you would use for a different rod. So I don't really want to go with all that complexity of a casting stroke. I just want to load it in a manner similar to a casting rod form. And this is one that I picked out for this rod. So if you imagine this point right here where this guide is located, how would I know how much this line up here is causing this point to bend? Well, it would be a couple factors. It would be the stiffness up above and the stiffness at this point, and it would be how much leverage that line has on this point. So you see, the problem here is that in order to know how the rod is bending, I have to know how the rod is bent. So you can't solve for a bend form straight directly. You have to do what's called an iterative method. So what that would mean is I would just randomly pick, say my tip is right here, and I would go back and calculate the bend form based on a tip being there. And the first thing I would find out is if I had the tip and I thought it was up here, I would actually have a rod that would bend a little more. So the next calculation I would come through and I would use this as my starting point. And then I would be up a little higher, and I would have to go through with my solution and try to keep calculating that and using the previous, or the ending point for the one calculation as a starting point for the next. And hopefully, if I do my math correctly, I can get that solution to stabilize. And I'll show you what that looks like. So I'm going to recalculate this, but I put a couple extra things in here that aren't normally available, and you'll be able to watch as this calculation kind of bounces through and finds the right bend form. Now this one's pretty quick, and you'll notice it takes a few seconds. It looks like nothing's happening, but in the end it's moving, and I try to make sure it settles down to a pretty tight dimension before I stop the calculation. So let's go. I'm going to speed this up a little bit. This is the time in between, and let's actually calculate a bunch more, and we're going to go ahead and overload this rod. So let's just watch as the solution goes through all of these. And what you'll see is it's actually going to line up on the first ones a little faster. And as I get the rod more and more tightly bent, it's going to be harder and harder for that calculation to settle down. And what I've noticed in all the time that I've been doing this, I've been working on this math for probably 15 or 20 years. Certain rods, like faster rods, the solution will stabilize a lot quicker and you'll get a little better results, or at least a little quicker results than you would get with a slow rod. You can watch through, we're getting pretty close to done here. So I'm going to turn off, after this is done, I will turn off, actually there's a few more to go. I'm going to stop this. So there's a few more to go. I'm going to just come back out and I'm going to show you what this would look like in fast motion. So it calculates pretty quick normally. But what you see here is by using that high acceleration factor here, I've actually calculated a bend form that's not realistic for casting. It still managed to calculate and find a bend form that matches this, but it's not very good. But let's go ahead and move this up a little farther. I'm going to drop the number down so it'll go quicker. Take that up to say 35. And if I do that, eventually what you're going to see is the solution goes unstable. And when you see something like this, you get a warning and you see like these lines pointed down. That's not realistic. It just basically means the program couldn't find a solution. And depending on how your taper is actually designed, it may be harder for the program to find a solution. So if you see something like this, that is a clue that not everything works. So let's take this back up here. And typically this is the kind of bend form I would expect to look for in a cast. So I think that's going to be it for this video. In the next video, we will talk a little more about doing some bend form analysis and comparing bend forms. Thank you.